you, please, who taught you to hate the texture of your hair? Who taught you to hate the color of your skin to such extent that you bleach to get like the white man? The most disrespected person in America is the black woman. The most unprotected person in America is the black woman. The most neglected person in America is the black woman.
Women's rights, an uphill battle that all women have been fighting since Eve took that fateful bite into the apple. All women, regardless of background or race, have dealt with a lingering struggle to gain independence for generations. But today we're going to focus on an often forgotten group of women, black women. Black women for far too long have struggled with extreme forms of assault in this country. Today we're going to explore the long, rough paths of black women in sexual assault, as well as how that sexual assault morphed itself into the verbal assault we see of black women today. We'll also explore what that means for our society and possible solutions for these conflicts. Assault. Verb. An intentional act by one person that creates an apprehension in another of impending, harmful, or offensive contact. Different types of assault include sexual, verbal, and of course, physical. The sexual assault of black women. The sexual assault of black women has always been prominent, most notably during the institutions of slavery and Jim Crow. The belief that African Americans as a race were all innately sexually active dates back generations, all the way back to the start of slavery, when European slave traders first stepped foot in African soil. The slave traders made assumptions about the natives. They saw the polygamous practices, tribal dances, and scant wear as lewd acts that proved Africans were just inherently sexually active. Stereotypes of sexual nature for Africans were birthed from that perception. Black men were carnal and potential rapists, and black women were insatiable whores who craved the attention of the white man. Derived from those beliefs was the stereotype of the Jezebel. Jezebel, noun, often not capitalized, an impudent, shameless, or morally unrestrained woman. Here's an example of a Jezebel. This clip is for the 1915 film, The Birth of a Nation, a film that's arguably the most racist film ever brought into existence. This is a character that goes by the name of Lydia Brown. And before you ask, yes, she is wearing blackface. Lydia Brown is a textbook example of what was believed to be the characteristics of a Jezebel. Lydia Brown's character is of mixed race and shown to have an unquenchable thirst for men of the Caucasian persuasion. She is said to be aroused when the character Charles Sumner asserts his dominance in an argument, and she is shown shortly after all but throwing herself at the man, only to face rejection. After Sumner exits, angered and aggrieved, Miss Brown throws a somewhat of a tantrum, spitting at his retreating form, heavy uneven breaths, clawing at clothes, and she even ends up strung out on the floor, all because she couldn't successfully gain the attention of a white male. At the end of her outburst, she rubs her breast in distress and does a sequence of movements that seem to emulate the motions of a drug addict in need of a hit. She then collects herself as she appears to be struck by some new idea. That idea is to begin a pursuit of her boss, who unsurprisingly is a white man. A stereotype like Jezebel was just another way of dehumanizing slaves, as well as another rationale for rape. Black women perceived as Jezebels were believed to covet or desire the advancement of the white man over a black man. It was once said slave women were, quote, gratified by the criminal advances of Saxons, unquote. This is a claim made by James Redpath, an abolitionist, by the way. Evidence of rape during slavery includes the story of Amanda America Dixon from the mid to late 1800s. She was the result of a rape her father, David Dixon, carried out on one of his slaves, Julia Frances Lewis Dixon, who was 13 at the time. The reason this story is so noteworthy is because of the fact that after Miss Dixon was born, her father made it so she would be raised white, naive to her black heritage. She grew up without the truth. It wasn't until her father died and left her his estate that her race came into question. Some would guess that at the end of slavery, these problems ceased, but others know better. When Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation was issued, slaves were allowed freedom, and the institution of slavery crumbled down. However, the institution of Jim Crow was quickly built back up in its place. The familiar weight of oppression lingered on the shoulders of a nation, and a familiar weapon of terror continued to reign: rape. Although the emancipation was supposed to bring freedom, it had some negative effects. Because of emancipation, African American women were then available to every white man instead of just being available to their owners and his associates. Sexual assault was used as a weapon of terror during slavery and remained one during Jim Crow. The assaults reinforced the economic, physiological, emotional, legal, and ideological dominance whites had over blacks, free or not. Night rides are a prime example of that weapon of terror being put to use. Night rides were as common as the moon is in the night sky, especially in the South. Essentially, gangs of white men would meet up and pile into their cars, usually at night, with the intent to inflict racial violence of the physical and or sexual nature onto African Americans. Of course, rides underneath the darkened sky were nothing new. These so-called night rides were very reminiscent of the night rides KKK members took to black southern towns post-slavery during the Reconstruction period. And maybe that was by design. A lot of the sexual assault cases famous for furthering the African American women's liberation movement were at fault of night rides. One of the most well-known and notarized cases is the case of Recy Taylor. This name may sound familiar to a few of you, given that Oprah Winfrey mentioned her name during her acceptance speech for the Cecil B. DeMille Lifetime Achievement Award at the 2018 Global Globes. For those who aren't familiar, this is Recy Taylor, and this is the book At the Dark End of the Street. This is the quote on the epigraph page. Inside are depictions of sexual assaults against black women in a racial context that parallels them. Recy Taylor's story is one of the many inside. And Recy Taylor's story goes as follows. It was September of 1944, and Recy Taylor was on her way home from church late one night when a car full of white men forced her to come with them. They ended up taking her to some abandoned part of the woods and gang raped her. After they were done, someone got her dressed, blindfolded her, and then they dropped her off on the side of the road. Even though the attack was reported to local law enforcement, along with an accurate description of the vehicle the assailants drove, none of which were convicted, even though 6 out of the 7 of the men involved unflinchingly admitted to committing the assault. It's worth mentioning that the sheriff personally knew some of the assailants, which is probably why he didn't help much with the investigation. Even with the help of civil rights activist Rosa Parks, whose job at the time was to investigate the sexual harassment claims black women made against white men, and the help of the rest of black liberals. Even with the help of civil rights activist Rosa Parks, whose job at the time was to investigate the sexual harassment claims black women made against white men, and the help of the rest of the black liberation movement, Recy Taylor died December 27, 2017, without justice. Another example of a night ride sexual assault is the story of Betty Jean Owens, which, by the way, is also recounted in this book. Owens' story starts off similar to Recy Taylor's story. It was May of 1959. Betty Jean Owens was on her way from a school dance with a friend and their dates when a car full of white men made them pull over. The white men forced them to get out the car and then proceeded to scare their dates away. They were leading Owens and her friend into their car when said friend escaped, leaving Owens alone. The men weren't deterred, and they went ahead and took her to the woods and gang raped her. This is where the similarities between this case and the Recy Taylor case end, because with the Recy Taylor case, although the assailants were correctly identified, they weren't prosecuted. They were set free. But with the Betty Owens case, the opposite occurred. Not only was it 15 years later, but it also was at a point in time when African Americans were much more outspoken on the topic of injustices, thanks to the involvement of the civil rights movement. So when news got out about a young black college student's rape, there was no stopping the outrage that led to the protests. As a result, the accused men were arrested, and the case went to court. And to everyone's surprise, the men were found guilty for their crimes and sentenced to life. Still, the sentence didn't come without its own hardships. During the hearing, the defense attorney would ask Betty Owens series of questions in an attempt to try to characterize her as a stereotypical black Jezebel, questions that alluded to the idea that she enjoyed the rape as opposed to hating it like she actually did, or that she found pleasure in it. Still, the final sentence represented one of the first times in the history of the South that white men accused of rape by a black woman were sentenced so severely. With the slow demise of Jim Crow, sexual assault had to become less common, or at least more discreet. And of course, black women were still getting raped, or at least something close to it, but over time, the sexual assault that happened in the shadows became the verbal assault that happens on our television screens or on social media. Black women and verbal assault. In 1991, Anita Hill accused Clarence Thomas, a Supreme Court nominee, of sexual misconduct in the workplace. An investigation followed her allegations, which ultimately led to a hearing. At said hearing, Anita Hill gave an opening statement with detailed reaccounts of the incidents. After the conclusion of her statement, she was then questioned. It was then, during the questioning, that one might draw the conclusion that there was a hint of racial microaggression, or at least sexist microaggression. After all that, Clarence Thomas still ended up being confirmed when the Senate voted 52 to 48. In media, African American women seem to always be under an overwhelming amount of scrutiny, especially black women in politics. When former political aide Omarosa Manigault left the White House back in January 2018, she made headlines with speculations over the cause of her departure. It was then a couple months later, in August, when headlines shifted from her to President Trump in his tweets in response to Omarosa's allegations that Trump was sexist and racist. Words like crazed, low-life, and most notably dogged gave some people pause. Comparing a black woman to an animal didn't sit well with many, and although Trump has used the term dog to attack white people, namely Senator Ted Cruz and Huffington Post founder Ariana Huffington, when used to describe a black woman in any context, there are bound to be some racial undertones, no matter the intent. Maxine Waters is another black woman that Trump has attacked. This time, he attacked the woman's intelligence. This isn't the first time Congresswoman Waters has been attacked. Far from it. Former Fox News host Bill O'Reilly in the past has made unsolicited comments about Waters. What does her hair have to do with anything she said? It's as if O'Reilly didn't want to acknowledge Miss Waters' statement, so he chose to acknowledge something that's asinine as a woman's hair. He's being dismissive, taking the focus off what she said and putting it on what she looks like. Is it possible that O'Reilly didn't just make an ignorant comment just because? But maybe, just maybe, he planned it. Solutions. For problems such as these that are so deeply ingrained in the institution of which we live under, it's hard to come up with a solve-all solution. But the most obvious solution that came to my mind was the womanist movement. A movement whose sole purpose is to combat attacks made against women of color as well as seek justice for those women. But for many, joining the movement might not be enough. Just looking at the womanist movement. The term womanist was coined almost 40 years ago in 1979 by Alice Walker in her short story Coming Apart. And neither the term or the movement has yet reached mainstream media. And as you and I know, a movement cannot elicit social justice if no one knows about it. So what is the solution if a movement isn't enough? Well, there may be a more systematic approach to the solution of this problem. What if, as a community, black women, or just women of color in general, made it their end goal to pursue politics, to be lobbyists, attorneys, judges, or even the president? Because that's when change occurs, when people in power make it. If women if women who have experienced the struggle gain power, they will use that power for good and be more empathetic towards people still experiencing the struggle. And this solution isn't as far fetched as it may seem because it's already happening. In the city of South Fulton, located in the state of Georgia, the entire municipal justice system of the city is in the hands of black women. Recently, the photo depicting this went viral, trending under the Twitter hashtag Black Girls Magic. Supreme Court Judge Sotomayor is another example of this initiative. Sotomayor is the first Hispanic female or male to serve on the Supreme Court. It's safe to say that she is an ally to minorities, being one herself, and that her position in the court will be impactful in more ways than one. To sum it up, in order for social conflicts to be resolved, the people involved in the conflicts have to find an ally or become an ally themselves. Someone who will be held accountable for their actions and not just brush it off for political gain. Finding someone with enough power to emphasize and make an effort to bring change is what solves social conflicts.
We have suffered discrimination. We have suffered isolation and undermining, but we stand up for America, oftentimes when others who think they are more patriotic, who say they're more patriotic, do not. When we fight against this president and we point out how dangerous he is for this society and for this country, we're fighting for the democracy. We're fighting for America. We're saying to those who say they're patriotic, but they turned a blind eye to the destruction that he's about to cause this country, you're not nearly as patriotic as we are.
So what does that mean, Bill? We've been listening all morning. We cannot.
I didn't hear a word she said. I was looking at the James Brown wig. If we have a picture of James, it's the same.
It's the same one,
No,
right? And he's
okay,
not using it
I gotta
anymore.
defend her on that.
You guys buried him.
You're all wrong about
I have
this.
to defend her on that. You can't go after a woman's looks. I think she's very attractive.
But I didn't say she wasn't attractive.
Her
I
hair's
love
pretty.
James Brown. But it's the same hair James Brown, or the godfather of soul, had.
So he had girl hair.
Whatever it is, I just couldn't get by it. You're all wrong about Maxine Waters. Number one, she's a sincere individual. Whatever she says, she believes. She's not a phony, all right?
That's right.
And that's old school, all right? If you're
Speaking
not a
of
phony,
old school, you got this new book coming out.
So we giving Maxine a break here. I love you, Maxine. I want to see you on The Factor. And when hell freezes over, I'm sure that'll happen.
Right. Now let's talk about old school for a second.
Yes.
Give me an example of old school.